get us going. First of all, thank you all for your bright and attentive presence here early in the morning on Saturday. We're grateful to have you here. We've got what I think will be an exciting and interesting discussion for everybody, and I hope it'll be participatory. So we hope we can involve you in the conversation as we get going. I'm just going to start, and I'm not going to talk much because you're not here to hear me. But I want to just set it up a little bit based on what we're doing here in the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. I'm the current chair of our American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. And the theme that we're talking about today is one that I've been focusing during the entire year. You know, people often ask me, too often ask me, since when does everything in this country always have to be about race? You know, I just want to look at them and say, since 1619? But I think a lot of Americans wouldn't even understand what I meant by that. What I mean by that is something that relates to something James Baldwin said, which is that if you don't know what happened behind you, you've got no idea what's happening around you. And what happened in 1619 and since is key to everything that's happening around us right now. You know, 9/11, we never forget. But this country, I think, has never even learned, much less forgotten, the truth of our terrorism of Black Americans. And we need to have that conversation. America has just never had a period or process of facing and reconciling slavery and what we've done since to the people we enslaved. Only 150 years ago, over 90% of African Americans were slaves in this country. Today, still, Black American wealth is 5% of white wealth. 5%. Think about how you would feel if you had only 5% of what you have, and that's just the financial side. Racism, white on black racism, is baked into our DNA. It was written into our Constitution, and it goes much deeper than that. It's embedded in our cultural psyche. And it's almost like a yeast-like ingredient that a lot of people don't see, but it just keeps on rising up. Conveniently for me, and most white Americans, being white in America means not having to worry about a racial identity. We just go about our day as individuals. We don't have to make the daily, small and significant adjustments African Americans do just to live while black in a white country. In order to progress through life, through education, through employment, just going to the store to buy milk, all while trying to make white folks feel comfortable. So we need to have this conversation. We need to, as a country, collectively and individually, we need to face directly the enduring effects of 4 centuries of slavery and oppression. And we need to not only face those effects, we need to face our denial about those effects. And not only about that, but about how richly we've profited as a country in every way. Scientifically, intellectually, spiritually, financially, from the people we oppressed. And we need to have that conversation all the time, every day, every place, everywhere we go. So as a section, we're trying to just do whatever little incremental bit we can to facilitate that conversation, to keep it going. And that's why we're here this morning, to start having some of that conversation. And we have with us a group of remarkable people who are going to help us talk about that. And I don't really want to spend time telling you about their sparkling resumes and their extraordinary accomplishments, because they are many. And you can see them in your materials, and you can Google them. But Professor Karla McKanders, Professor Paul Butler, Tanya, trust me, they've got something powerful to say and something you'll want to hear. So we're going to start out having each of them talk to you a little bit, and then we'll start having a conversation about some of the things that they're talking about in this area. So thank you all. First of all, can you please give a round of applause to these folks who've come. Thank you very much. Karla, you would go first.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I would like to thank the Civil Rights and Social Justice Committee for inviting me to participate in this panel. I was asked to speak on this panel to place in context how this administration's policies have continued America's use of immigration laws to promulgate fear and exclusion to define what America looks like. Specifically, I was asked to discuss recent anti-immigrant policies and their impact on immigrants, including African immigrants living in the United States. So in my brief time, I would like to do three things. First, to provide you with a historical background on how immigration laws have operated in a manner to attempt to maintain the homogeneity and exclusion of immigrants of color. Second, I will discuss some of the recent national victories in the face of the administration's attempts to curtail migration from Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And I am a clinical professor at Vanderbilt University, and what I think is most important in terms of the immigration, civil rights, and social justice lawyering are the small everyday victories that are occurring despite the multiple changes this administration is making to the immigration court system. So I'll talk about that at the end. So we should be reminded that immigration laws throughout the American history have used fear and exclusion to define what America looks like and has privileged some immigration narratives over others. For example, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924 required a quota system for nationalities in which Japanese immigrants were banned, and only a small number of Eastern and Southern European immigrants were permitted to enter, whereas Irish, German, and British immigrants were permitted to enter in the United States in large numbers. While the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was passed at the height of the civil rights movement to ban this national quota system and to shift to an immigration system that was based upon family unity and privileging skilled laborers, this law at the time still privileged white America, with 7 out of 8 immigrants were still coming from European countries. And it was only in 2010 that 9 out of 10 immigrants were coming from countries outside of Europe. So as we examine the administration's immigration policies, we must keep in mind how America's history of immigration policies have traditionally excluded immigrants of color. Since 2016, this administration has followed through on its promise to make America great again and restrict immigration from Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. The ultimate goal is to shape what America looks like and to prevent the blackening and browning of America. These policies have ranged from parents being separated from their children, to migrants from predominantly Muslim majority countries being banned from the United States, to skyrocketing rates of deportations of migrants from African countries. The common thread amongst the headlines that are highlighted is what history has continued to show us, that people of color are targets of unjust immigration policies and practices. This president has promoted narratives stating, and I quote, "migrants from shithole countries coming here," referring to Haiti and African countries, stating that the U.S. should get more people to come from countries like Norway to migrate to the United States, and calling immigrants animals. This has influenced the development and enforcement of our immigration policies and has rationalized explicit racism. For example, the Department of Homeland Security rescinded temporary protected status for for El Salvador, Haiti, Sudan, Nicaragua, and recently Somalia. Temporary protected status is a form of immigration relief that is granted when a country is facing ongoing armed conflict, an environmental disaster like an earthquake or hurricane, and it allows foreign nationals to live and work in the United States temporarily. The NAACP filed a lawsuit, NAACP versus the Department of Homeland Security, along with Haitian organizations, alleging that the cancellation of temporary protected status discriminated against Haitian immigrants in violation of the Fifth Amendment. This lawsuit was based upon the president's statements, coupled with the fact that the conditions in Haiti gave rise to the original grant of TPS in 2010 continued to exist. In addition to the NAACP's lawsuit, several lawsuits were filed, but in October of 2018, in Ramos versus Nelson, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California enjoined the department from implementing and enforcing the decisions to terminate TPS for Sudan, Nicaragua, Haiti, and El Salvador. The judge ruled that, and I quote, that the administration was guided by racism, not a sober consideration of the facts on the ground when it canceled TPS status designations for the countries that were escaping from political and natural disasters. While the TPS injunction is a small victory, we are aware that the president's sweeping powers over immigration permit him to invoke national security as a shield to implement his racist policies, i.e. the Muslim ban. Under this administration, there have been skyrocketing removal rates of African nationals that have increased from 2016 to 2017. Somali nationals have experienced the highest rate of removal under this administration. Last year, and I'd like to highlight the work of my colleagues in clinics, the University of Miami's Immigration Clinic led a class action suit amongst, on behalf of 92 men and women, Somali men and women, in a botched abusive deportation flight to Somalia. Somalis were shackled and beaten for almost 2 days and left sitting on the tarmac in Senegal on the runway. The Miami Immigration Clinic's lawsuit got an injunction and the plane was turned around. And the lawsuit cited U.S. asylum law, the Refugee Convention, which forbids the removal of individuals to countries where they would face the likelihood of persecution or torture. When the Somali nationals returned to the United States, they were provided an opportunity to reopen their deportation orders and apply for withholding of removal or asylum. Based upon the lawsuit, their Somali nationals have immigration proceedings, deportation proceedings that are pending in the court in Florida. While there have been many class action and national lawsuits that make headlines every day, there are multiple changes to the immigration court proceedings that will have a lasting impact on the due process rights of immigrants. For example, the previous Attorney General utilized a provision in the federal regulations that allows him to refer immigration cases to himself to establish new precedent, including in matter of Castro-Tama case, he limited the immigration judge's ability to control their own docket, not permitting immigration judges to administratively close cases. In another decision, a matter of AB, the Attorney General again referred this case to himself and limited the protections for domestic violence asylum seekers and attempted to limit protections for asylum seekers where the persecutor is a non-state actor with the intent to mainly curtail and delegitimize Central American asylum claims. And in Jennings versus Rodriguez, this case limited the ability of asylum seekers to apply for bond pending their removal proceedings, which has caused many asylum seekers to be detained for years, which strictly reduces their access to counsel. In this context, the civil rights lawyering that occurs on a daily basis in our immigration courts across the country are where lawyers are waging battles all over the country. I would like to highlight the Immigration Commission's direct efforts to ensure the fair treatment and full due process rights for immigrants. For example, in October, I'm on the Immigration Commission for the American Bar Association. I had the opportunity to visit the Immigration Justice Project in San Diego, which provides legal orientation programs for detained immigrants. They also provide representation for disabled immigrants, and they attempt to get bond for immigrants who are in the detention facility. I witnessed these attorneys, very dedicated, a small group of attorneys, litigating cases day in and day out on a very, very small budget. When I was there in October, I witnessed the dedication of these attorneys going to the detention facility at 12 o'clock at night to do the job that the Department of Homeland Security should have been doing in training the detention staff about immigrants' rights and their ability to access counsel. The ABA's Immigration Commission also has a division, the South Texas Pro Bono Asylum Representation Project, which is a national effort to provide pro bono legal services to asylum seekers who are detained in South Texas. I think it's important to highlight the efforts of these groups because, again, what we see in the press and the national news are one part of the story, and the other part are the immigration attorneys that are working at the border, the immigration attorneys that are in courtrooms on a daily basis that are fighting this administration's efforts. To end, I want to tell a story, and that story is in response to the administration's newly enacted restrictions on asylum seekers. This past December, I took 2 students from Vanderbilt to volunteer with an organization, El Otro Lado, that works on the Tijuana border. My students and I provided Know Your Rights presentations at shelters and refugee camps and provided one-on-one consultations to asylum seekers, some of whom were waiting at the border for 3 months to approach. The last day that I was there to volunteer, I led a team of lawyers providing consultations at a women and children's shelter. One story that particularly impacted me was a woman from Cameroon who I had provided a consultation. She had been waiting at the shelter for 3 months just to approach the border. Cameroon is known for its political instability in the north region, which has caused forced migration, unrest, torture, and abuse by security forces, including military and unofficial detention facilities. The Cameroonian woman was raped by the government security forces who were responding to unrest in the Anglophone regions of the country. She immediately researched visa-free countries to which she could fly to, got on a flight to Ecuador, and from the generosity of many people made her way to the U.S.-Mexican border. When she arrived, she could not walk up to the border and applied. As she discovered in December, there was a list controlled and with oversight from the Mexican migration authorities. She had to wait 3 months, and I emphasize again, in the women's shelter before she could even approach the border. I counseled her about the process, what to expect when she approached the border, and to expect to be detained if she got into the United States. She began to cry. She had experienced a triple trauma in her country of origin, then migrating to the United States, and then the shock of finding no protection when she reached her destination at the border. This woman's story demonstrates the direct impact of the Trump administration's policy and the operation, what I was going to say before yesterday, of informal structures, now formalized structures through the migration protection protocols to limit access to asylum procedures. And I think that her case is important because I believe that it's the combination of individual cases alongside the large class action lawsuits that we hear in the press, where attorneys are constantly challenging this administration's discriminatory policies that evince the power of advocacy and the ability to have small victories in immigration courts. And to end, I just want to emphasize, I think that as attorneys that we can participate, and you can, just like I did, go down to the border and volunteer. You don't have to speak Spanish. There are interpreters that are provided for you. And just like my law students did, you can give Know Your Rights presentations. Asylum law is very easy to learn. There are 5 elements, and you can give consultations to individuals like the Cameroonian woman that I gave advice to. There are also, you can remotely represent people. There are a lot of projects like the Innovation Law Lab that allow attorneys to do pro bono work on behalf of asylum seekers, and you can definitely take on at least one case and contribute. Because I definitely believe, I've been in Tennessee for about 10 or 11 years now, and Tennessee is a state where there aren't that many immigration attorneys, and I've had to convince a lot of law firm attorneys to take on cases, and they're very rewarding. So if you're interested, please come up to me afterwards, and I will definitely connect you with resources so that you can volunteer and contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Karla. And we'll have a chance to talk more with Karla even before or after the program, when we have a little bit more of a dialogue in a few minutes, but I want to go through and have everybody speak a little bit. But Karla has highlighted something very important, that there is indeed a crisis at the border. It's just a different crisis than we've been told it is. So, Tanya, if you could go from there.
So, is this on?
Is it?
Yeah. Good.
Did y'all hear something?
Yeah.
I don't know what you're saying. Okay. Okay. So good morning. Is it morning?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. I'm on East Coast time still, so none of my clocks have changed, so just so I can remember to tell my kids good night. So thank you, well, for having this panel, and thank you for acknowledging and putting it, making this a topic of conversation that we need to continue to have, and not staying away from this. I think that oftentimes we don't like to have these direct conversations about the impact of race in our country, the impact of race in all of our social systems, how this country has established on oppression and the use of race as a means of oppressing an entire community. So that being said, we need to have the conversations, and we also need to understand how things have evolved throughout the years, and what this administration is also doing in a way that I think many people don't even fully realize and appreciate, because of the chaos that you see flashing on your TV screen every day. That chaos is intentional in order to divert your attention from what is actually happening behind the scenes in many of the agencies that is going to have decades of impact upon our country. I'm not going to get into one thing I probably should have said, I should have talked about it, the judges, but I'm not going to get in there. That's just depressing. I'm going to focus primarily on issues of voting rights and education, and talk about some of the, particularly the systemic racism that is within the systems, and that some of the ways in which we have attempted to counter and correct some of these challenges that we have faced throughout our country. So I often like to, these issues are particularly important to me. I've worked on a variety of issues throughout my years, but voting rights and education have always held a special place. I do believe education is a civil right, and I think that it's fundamental to the success and the ability of people to succeed in this country. And in order to ensure that you are able to participate fully in this country, you need to understand how to civically engage and participate in this system, and understand what it actually means. So I'm going to bring these two together in that manner. I often like to start and talk about a there's a quote that I tend to love, primarily because I'm a runner and it has a running mentality in it. It was actually by LBJ, and he essentially says, you do not take a person who has been hobbled by chain for years, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying that you are free to compete with others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. And I really believe that this really incorporates how it is that we need to understand how we deal with the racism that has been infused within our systems. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed at the same time the Elementary Secondary Education Act was passed. Remember that. Think about that. These are civil rights bills. People think oftentimes of the Voting Rights Act, that's a civil rights bill. The Elementary Secondary Education Act was passed at the same time, establishing the Department of Education. It was established as a means to ensure that all students had access to free public education. And so these are two things that really are meaningful, that people understood, people fought for during the civil rights era, to understand that these are fundamental to ensure that people are able to achieve and be able to live that American dream. So let me start with voting rights. You know, in the past election, we saw an enormous increase in the number of people that came out. We heard about how the numbers seem to rival, actually, general elections. Well, not quite. I mean, we still are at about less than 50%, but it's not good, but it's much better than it had been. And in fact, this turnout rate is actually in stark contrast to about 36.7% of those that came out in the midterm elections in 2014. And so just that increase alone tells you how meaningful and important this ability, this right to vote, people are understanding how meaningful that really is. Young voters shattered records, and they turned out at 31%, 10 points higher than in 2014. You had a record 39 million people that voted early in 2018. And in 27 states, the number of people who voted early exceeded the entire vote total in that state in 2014. So the right to vote is fundamental. People are starting to understand that. And I think even as people of color, people that have been traditionally disenfranchised and historically disenfranchised are starting to understand and appreciate how they can impact their society by being civically engaged. Those that are not interested in these same people impacting their society have also figured out another way to suppress the vote. And they've figured out that, you know, although we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we understand that it has been severely impaired. Let's just say it. I know many of us attorneys like to say, well, you know, there's other things. Yes, there are, but this is a problem. And Section 4, when it was ruled unconstitutional because the formula needed to actually be updated, and therefore severely undermining and just eliminating the ability to utilize Section 5, this was extremely detrimental. What that does is it has inhibited the Department of Justice from oversight of those states that have a history of racial discrimination against people of color. And so what that then enables those who are interested in suppressing the vote to go about their business unencumbered, and to move and to change polling places, to enact voter purges, to not inform people and give people proper notice of how it is that they should engage in their electoral process. There are other methods by which people are they're suppressing the vote. By summarily eliminating people from the voting rolls. I talked about these voter purges. We've had a number of cases that were brought up. And I'm going to go through a series of cases. I'm not going to go into depth. I'm going to kind of mention some of them. But I want to emphasize that those that are not interested in ensuring that we have all people are equally able to participate in our voting, in our election process, are doing it for a reason, because they understand that this is important for them to ensure that they can maintain power. All right? And that power and that privilege is what has enabled and what this country actually has been based upon. Racial privilege, racial oppression, the ability to suppress others in order to maintain your own privilege and power in society. And so that is no different in the voting context. We'll get to the education as well. And so right now, the voter suppression has manifested its way in a variety of different ways. And we are seeing it evolve constantly. When I first started engaging professionally back in 2001, after what some call an election, I call it a travesty. But when we should have a Supreme Court appointing somebody. But we're now beyond that. But the point is that it was revealed to many who were not familiar and understanding what was happening that there's an effort going on. And now there's always been voter suppression that's been taking place across this country. But I think people had not fully appreciated how massive that effort has been and that this is actually coordinated. And so in addition to the voter purges, there was this mythology put in place about voter fraud, that somehow the people that you're trying to encourage to vote are somehow committing voter fraud because they're not eligible, they're not citizens. And so that mythology has then created this desire, this belief that we need to now create additional barriers, voter ID, right? Citizenship requirements, all of these types of barriers in order to restrict the vote. This is something that I've been working on for a number of years, both on the policy level and working with in Congress and also in the administration. And we know it's a mythology. We know that massive voter fraud does not exist. However, that does not eliminate the perception that now has been created in our society that there is voter fraud. And so we have these manifestations of policies that have been created in states and even in the federal level to require that people now have to provide voter ID. And so we had a series of cases that have come up. I mean, Texas, I think many of the civil rights organizations were a part of voter ID cases in Texas. That case had been found that they intentionally enacted this voter ID in order to suppress particularly people of color. We've also had citizenship requirements that have manifested themselves across in other states, over in Arizona and other places as well. One of my jobs that I do right now is help to fund I work with a foundation that helps to fund many of the voting rights and civil rights organizations that engage in the litigation. And so, as I said, there have been lawsuits brought in Texas on voter ID by a variety of organizations like Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, MALDA, ACLU and others. NAACP, LDF has also brought cases as well. We have the proof of citizenship cases have been filed in Kansas to deal with that. And so, again, these things continue to evolve, and this is something that we have recognized throughout the years. I mentioned voter purging is also another way in order to suppress the vote. And we saw this really come about in Ohio recently. Unfortunately, we had a bad ruling in Ohio with the voter purging, indicating that they could actually purge people from the rolls, and ostensibly for non-voting. There's a technicality within that, but yes, they could purge them. But again, this is really about the impact of these types of laws. It has been proven over and over again through research throughout the years that this is disproportionately affecting people of color. And that's been the intent. We've seen that in fact, the research has not only borne that out, in fact, case law, particularly in Texas and Georgia, they talked about, the legislatures had the indeed intent of trying to restrict and inhibit the ability of people of color, African Americans in particular, to vote. So yes, racism exists, and it is something that we have to continue to fight against within the voting rights context. I want to move to education, but before I do, I want to briefly say that in addition to a lot of the voter suppression that continues to take place, we also see that manifesting itself in other ways in what may not be traditionally considered voting rights arena, but it's another type of suppression, and that's in the census and redistricting context. There's a variety of cases that have evolved as well. We've had some not so appreciated rulings from the Supreme Court on redistricting, but recently on the census, there's been a number of cases that have been filed, again, by organizations that we're working with to support. There's a lawsuit that's brought on behalf, make sure I have this right, yeah, there's lawsuits brought in California on behalf of the City of San Jose and the Black Alliance for Just Immigration in order to challenge the citizenship question in California. There's a recent case that's actually being argued now that was brought in Maryland, being argued by Mexican American Legal Defense Education Fund and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And I think the case that you all probably heard about, in which we had a positive ruling in New York, that was also led by the ACLU, essentially New York v. Commerce, which made it clear that the citizenship question will make the 2020 census less accurate. The citizenship question was put into the census, again, what we have all been arguing as a methodology, as a method of trying to suppress those that would like to engage in our process. And that's what this is about. And so, because this suppression, as I said, is showing itself in many, many ways. And I want to continue to talk about that in kind of our back and forth, but I want to move briefly into education to say, again, because people know that if you engage, if you civically engage, you understand how it's working in our process, then there's ways in which they're going to, those that do not want you to engage in the process are going to try to suppress your vote. But they also don't want you to understand how that process works. And so they don't want you to be educated about what that means. And so education is not just about education in the context of learning your A's and B's and understanding and learning how it is history works, so that you know where you came from in order to move forward. But it is also understanding being educated about your electoral process. But again, education is a civil right that all of us are deserving of. Brown v. Board indicated that we should not be discriminated against based upon our race, and that segregation in schools, in fact, will not provide that quality education that we all deserve. And so education is something that also this particular administration has been targeting in very deliberate ways in order to undermine and stop those that have been, again, traditionally disadvantaged and underrepresented from being properly educated. Since I left the Department of Education, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary there in policy, and we enacted a number of reforms and a number of regulations came out. Since I left, I'm just going to name, because I know I'm going way over. I'm going to name a number of the regulations that have been rescinded. Title IX, discipline in schools. Significant disproportionality. If you don't know that, it's a long word term, but what that means is the identification, placement, and discipline of students with disabilities, and ensuring that there's no disparity in how they are identified, placed, and disciplined. That rule has been delayed it was supposed to come into inaction, but now it's been delayed. And we suspect they're going to try to rescind that as well. There are a host of rules that this administration is trying to undermine. Diversity in schools, that was the first one out of the box. That was one in particular that was dear to my heart, because it was the first time the Department of Education had actually adopted a policy and had moved forward on a grant program to ensure that we were actually being true to what Brown v. Board said, which is that integration and diversity in schools is a means to achieve quality education for all students, not just Black and brown students, but for all students. That was pulled back immediately within about less than 2 months after this administration came in. They took away potential grants that school districts had actually already applied for in order to ensure and to create systems of integration and diversity in school. That has been that has been pulled back. And then we're undermining our public school system. Instead of actually wanting to fully fund our public school system, there have been efforts in place to move additional funding away from our public schools to support privatized education, which is not the mission of the Department of Education, but also to support charter schools, which, whatever your position on charter schools, they were not created in order to undermine the traditional public schools that is free for all students. And so this administration has been on a mission to not provide and allow for equality education, not just of students of color, but LGBTQ students, students with disabilities, women, all students who have been underrepresented, have been disenfranchised, have been oppressed within our community. And so I urge you, all of you here, to pay attention to what's happening here. And that there are a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that you as lawyers, but just educated folk, can help us to combat and bring attention to and make sure that people are not staying ignorant and just paying attention to the glossy things that are happening on TV. And so I started with a quote. I want to end with another famous quote. I always get to where I'm going by leaving where I've been. By the infamous Winnie the Pooh. Because it's true. We can't evolve into our great society and continue to and be that model of freedom and democracy and justice and equality for all if we don't leave where we've been. And this administration is taking us back. We know what was not right, and we should not be going backwards. So I encourage you all to help us to continue to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think those comments are very trenchant. 53 years ago now, on the steps of the Capitol of Alabama in Montgomery, Dr. King asked the question, how long, not long? Turns out it was much longer than that. And now we're going back to something that's, I think, closer to where we were at the Civil War. We're moving back so fast, where all of your examples show that it's horrifying. So, Professor, please.
Criminal justice and racial justice. I want to imagine 3 scenes from a movie. The first scene is in Nashville. It's 2017. We're at the Fraternal Order of Police National Convention. It's the largest organization of police officers in the country. Its leadership is 7 white men. It had endorsed Donald Trump for president, and now, at its national conference, Attorney General Jefferson Beauregard Sessions has come to deliver the goods. Sessions announced is that he's reversing the Obama administration's policy of going after local police departments for civil rights violations. He's bringing back private prisons, reversing a ban that Attorney General Loretta Lynch had put in place. He's deprioritizing the recommendations of President Obama's Policing Commission. He's cracking down on sanctuary cities, and he's bringing back civil asset forfeiture. So at this police convention, Sessions is like Santa Claus, handing out gifts. And here's the most revealing present. Remember during the Ferguson uprising on MSNBC and CNN, we saw those tanks in the streets. And then the country learned that those tanks came from a program where the Pentagon gave surplus military equipment to local police departments. A lot of people think that the Obama administration ended that program, but it didn't. What it did do was say that local police departments can't have every kind of weapon that they want from the Pentagon. And specifically, they couldn't have surplus military equipment that was intended to be used against enemies of the United States in war. The other stuff, the battering rams, the assault rifles, etc., the Obama administration actually let the police departments continue to get. But now, Sessions announces he's restoring the whole program. So now, local police departments can get from the Pentagon for free grenade launchers, tanks, bayonets. When Sessions makes that announcement at the police convention, the whole audience erupts in cheers. Scene 2. Scene 2 is a montage of cell phone videos. Black people having the police call up on us. When you look at these videos, I think of what the first question is when you call 911 in New York City. The first question the dispatcher asks you is, what is your emergency? In these videos, what the 911 caller would have had to say is, 2 black men sitting at a Starbucks, 4 African American women moving into an Airbnb, black women golfing slowly, Yale graduate student napping. And thanks to Black Twitter, now a lot of the people who call the police are infamous. I don't think the people who call the police are the main problem. They're a big problem. They are a big problem with their everyday racism. Everyday racism requires a performance from people of color. Every time we navigate public spaces, we might conspicuously display our work IDs, we might look down on the elevator. One black man says that when he's walking down the street, he whistles Vivaldi to let people know that he's not a threat. So the people who call the police, they can fill you with a productive kind of rage or a corrosive kind of hate. They're spirit murderers, but still, they're not the main problem. The main problem is the response of the state. Because what the state does is to send a man or a woman with a gun over to investigate the suspicious black problem. So it's kind of like the 911 caller. She pitches a white supremacist fantasy to the dispatcher. And then the dispatcher green lights that pitch. The spectacle is produced. So black people are forced by armed agents of the state to justify our presence. The black person has the burden of proof. The person who calls the police is assumed to be correct. So the last thing I'll mention is what's next. There's this great documentary about Cory Booker. It's about when he first ran for mayor of Newark. He actually lost that race, but he generated a lot of excitement. And there's this scene in the movie where this little girl, she's about 7 or 8, and she's just shaking hands with Cory Booker, and she's so excited. And the filmmaker goes up to her, he's filming her, and he says, "Did you meet Cory Booker?" And she says, "Yeah." And then she says, "And I smelled him." And the filmmaker says, "Well, what did he smell like?" And the little girl pauses for a second, she thinks, and then she smiles and she says, "He smelled like the future." Well, what does the future of criminal justice smell like? So, I want to, again, reference that great legal scholar who you did, Winnie the Pooh. And think about leaving where we've been to get to where we're going. So the future of the criminal legal process smells like abolition. And that makes sense in terms of racial justice if you think that for African Americans, the central struggles have been struggles about abolition. Abolition of slavery, abolition of the old Jim Crow. And now the movement for Black Lives is focused on abolition of the new Jim Crow. So in my book, Chokehold, just came out in paperback, I talk about what that would look like. Prison abolition sounds crazy, but think about what is it that we believe that prison does. So I think most people would say, well, prison keeps us safe from people who would harm us if they weren't locked up. And prison makes people who cause harm accountable. Those of us who have worked in the criminal legal process know that prison doesn't do either of those very well. And so the question is, are there ways that we can do that better? It doesn't do it well now. And we're thinking about abolition. A lot of people get this in the context of abolition of the death penalty. So some of us are abolitionists in terms of the death penalty because we think There's no way that the United States can select out people who get punished by execution in a way that's not all about race and class. And it turns out the same thing is true about selecting people to go to prison. So I teach my criminal law students that prison is for people who are the most dangerous or the most immoral. We know that's the theory. That's not the practice. And I don't know if there's a way that we can choose who the most dangerous and immoral people are in this country. If there's a way we could do that, that's not all about race and class. And so then the question is, can we use our American ingenuity to think of a better way? So we're the people who created jazz and gospel music and hip hop. We're the country that created the World Wide Web and Apple computer. Can we use that ingenuity and creativity to think of ways to keep us safe and to make people who've harmed others responsible that don't involve locking people in cages? So prison abolition doesn't mean opening every door tomorrow. Think of it as a process of gradual decarceration with an eye on how many people can we let come home in a way that we're still safe. Conservative estimate from the Brennan Center is 40%. 40% of people who are locked up could come home tomorrow and there wouldn't be any cost of public safety. I think the number is much higher than that. So again, to end, this is about not letting Donald Trump set the agenda. He would love for us to be focused on arguments about why the police should not be allowed to use bayonets and grenade launchers against the people who they're supposed to serve and protect. But dreaming big, imagining abolition, is an act of resistance. And the other speakers have ended with calls to you, so I'll do the same thing. I'll do it in the context of a thought experiment that I have. Sometimes I wonder if I had been born during slavery, what I would have done. I hope I would have been a runaway. I hope I would have been one of those people who organized slave uprisings. And then I wonder, well, what if I've been around and politically active during the civil rights movement? You know, I hope that I would have joined my mother is here, my aunt is here. I hope I would have joined them in marching with Martin Luther King and taking it to the streets with Malcolm. But we know that just as most slaves didn't run away, most people, black, white, Latino, Asian, Native, they weren't involved in the civil rights movement back then. And the movement for Black lives, they say if you want to know what you would have done back in the day, ask yourself, what are you doing right now? Because this movement is one of the most important human rights movements of our lifetime. I hope that many of you will use your legal skills and your status in the community to resist, to dream big until that day when Black lives matter, until that day when there actually is equal justice under the law.
Thank you, Paul. Zora Neale Hurston wrote in Barracoon that the slave trade and its aftermath is one of the most horrifying and dramatic stories in human history. And yet the story that's heard has always come from the seller, not the sold. And so that's why it's so important that I have these folks here who can speak to you and that you can listen to. So I hope you've heard, and I hope you have some questions that will prompt them to talk to you some more about this and have a conversation. So are there folks out there who would like to ask a question of our speakers? Yes, now I'm come down here with Mike so that we can get you both on the recording and heard by everybody else. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Rashida. I actually go to Howard University School of Law right now, and I think we see Mr. Butler. I actually have a few questions, and I hope that's okay.
That's fine.
My first one's regarding immigration. I do want to meet with you after to talk about how a student can get involved in volunteering. As far as voting rights, Ms. House, I have a question for you. When it came to the Ohio voter purges, I was wondering how the Ohio court was treating the voting purges that they were doing, because the way that you were describing it was sort of like the lost opportunity kind of thing with parenting. You had, when you don't do it, then you lose it kind of thing. Were they treating it that way? And then how does the due process argument get ignored if there is, someone's fundamental right being taken away?
Right. Well, it's a great question. I think it's something people often, I think all of us ask the same question. Maybe it doesn't work on ask the same question, which is why the lawsuit was originally brought, because let me give you the facts, actually, that were, because this will give you a better understanding of what was happening. Ohio, the Secretary of State was sending out notices to those who had not voted in two elections, or in past elections. And it was then declaring those who did not respond to verify their address or verify that they were indeed registered. I actually have to go back and make sure that that was actually what it was, but I know that if they did not respond, then they were pulled off of the voting rolls. And so the challenge was that the National Voter Registration Act says you should not be removed for non-voting, right? You have a right to vote. And so that's what the challenge was brought. The court said that the notice that there indeed was not, they were not improperly moved because they were given notice, and that in fact this was not a violation of their constitutional right under the National Voter Registration Act, and that notice that was sent out essentially was sufficient. And so yes, none of us agree, those that work in this space, that is a sufficient way, but unfortunately that was the ruling, and so as a result, it opened the possibility for other states now to move forward, with this type of practice, and the censorship at large, and saying that they can remove people without sufficient notice. I mean, the claim also that was brought was that the fact that, so the notice that was sent basically looked to many people probably like junk mail. And so that was a big issue. That, often, I get things, I look at my mail in bulk because I don't always look at it every day like I probably should. And so, you have a stack of mail. And it was not clear to voters that they needed to respond. And so that in and of itself was the problem. But unfortunately, that was considered proper. And so that is how the court justified in the 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court that indeed that this was noticed and that they could actually continue on this practice. So I'm hoping that explains a little bit more as to the due process angle in this, which is that obviously they weren't given, we don't believe, I think, yes, there's an argument, the argument was made. But the Supreme Court ruled that in fact in the 5-4 decision that notice was sufficient.
Thank you. My very last question is for Mr. Butler. I don't know if you had heard of Larry Krasner, what he's doing in Philadelphia, but how do you think that that will impact the criminal justice system if we can get more prosecutors on board with progressive prosecuting?
So I think it would make a difference in the short term. I work with a group of progressive prosecutors that's designed to get people who are concerned about these issues to think about them in a way from people who are exercising their discretion. Prosecutors are probably the most unregulated actor in our criminal legal process. They have more power than judges. And so now we have this, a wave is a too grandiose a term, but we have a few people who run on platforms of reducing incarceration, reducing disparities, and they're running for DA. And the most successful example, I think, is Kim Foxx in Chicago, who, after the previous prosecutor covered up the murder of Laquan McDonald, and I say murder is a legal term since that's what the jury found, that Officer Van Dyke murdered Laquan McDonald. Anita Alvarez, the previous DA, she had that tape of the murder in a locked drawer in her office, and she sat on it. And when the people found out, they rose up and they elected an African-American woman named Kim Foxx. And she said that she was going to bring the officers who did that to justice. And at least in terms of the trigger man, she was able to do that. And so that's a visceral result of a progressive prosecutor trying to do the right thing for her community. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think that the transformation that we need is going to come from prosecutors, but in the short term, again, they can make a big difference.
I think this young lady over here was next. Thank you.
Okay, this was just really, really powerful. And, really appreciate you bringing all this information in the section for bringing this great opportunity. I have two comments and a question. I'm a Title VII plaintiff's lawyer on the top of the 7 protected classes, and there are very, very few people of color who practice in that area. I go to seminars that are in a room of 100 people. I'll be 2. So I want to just mention, lift that up. That is some of the work that needs doing, and there are organizations that could mentor, because it is a long haul. It is convoluted with the state rules, the federal rules, and the timing is short, and all the rest of the statutes of limitation. A little scary, but there are organizations such as National Employment Lawyers Association and their state affiliations. I'm in Florida. We have a very, very strong one. So if anybody's interested, let me know. And we will mentor and work with young lawyers, older lawyers, but we need help. Okay. And I never hear people talking about that, which I know criminal justice is huge. It's got to be addressed, but how we live in our daily life and how people can be eroded and corroded in their lives by what they are, whether it's a woman, their sexual identity, whatever it is that they can do the job. Back off of that. This is very corrosive and destructive to people's spirits, souls, and families. And I just don't hear people talking about it. I'm like, whoa, what's up with that? So I want to throw that out there. The next comment I have is I'm here primarily on behalf of Amendment 4, which in the state of Florida, we were able to get the people to rise up and vote for Amendment 4, which is restoration of ex-felons' rights once they finish their sentence, excluding murderers and sexual felony. Anyway, we're super thrilled. We're really happy. We are asking ABA lawyers, and we're going around talking with different sections and any attorneys around the nation. We need volunteers to be schooled on the basics of what's going on so that they can be resources for the returning citizens if they have questions about whether their sentence is completed. We're talking with the ABA, and we're going to develop some webinars when we get CLE, but we really need help, and I'll stay afterwards if anybody's interested. We can continue to communicate. But as you said, voting is primary. It is the essence of how all of these things are being shifted. The vote allowed powers to change, and things are being undone. So that's a fundamental thing. Since this is impacting the whole nation, we're asking for the nation of lawyers to come to our aid. My question, and that is, how do you get people to talk about these uncomfortable conversations? I mean, we have self-selected. We are woke in some way. Those of us in this room, we're kind of preaching to the choir. We still need to hear it. But I have not heard anybody talk to me about how do we do this kind of work in arenas like I'm in the Deep South. People, they do not want to talk about this. I'm just saying, most of us live in, or a lot of us live in communities that are not in the big city. How do we bring this conversation? How do we do that, give me some tools or some books or maybe we need book clubs. What do we need to do to bring this past the woke group of people who are in this room?
Great question. Somebody wants to speak to that?
I can begin to answer because I've been practicing in Tennessee and Knoxville, Tennessee for about 8 years, and in a place where there aren't immigration lawyers, and the immigration court was 6 hours away from Knoxville and 3 hours away from Nashville. And I think that at its essence, developing relationships with people so you can have the conversations with them is part of what I engage in, especially in Knoxville, where having a conversation about immigration with the community can be very challenging. And beginning to develop relationships with people, that is my starting place to engage with people about the myths and misperceptions that they have about immigrant communities. And it's on a very small level that I engage. And as a professor, one of my goals is to, especially when I was teaching at the University of Tennessee, I had students from a wide spectrum of political perspectives, and some of whom enrolled in my immigration clinic. And by teaching them and having them engage in the process, one of my greatest victories was a student that came from a very conservative background, and when she took on an immigration case where she was challenging the notice to appear in court, we had a telephonic hearing, and the notice to appear is the complaint to immigration court, and most attorneys until recently would just admit the claims and then move to the form of relief, the defense for being removed from the country. She was representing a child. I won't make this story too long. And the complaint had errors in terms of the child was under 18, the guardian had signed it, and she challenged that in front of a judge. And the judge told her at the end of her hearing that anytime she was going to challenge a notice to appear, that she had to drive 6 hours with her unaccompanied minor child across the state and appear in person. It was clearly a punitive measure because the judge wanted us to toe the line and admit the allegations in the notice to appear. And so I tell the story because it impacted the student. She works for a very conservative member of Congress, and she would always call me and ask me questions about immigration and then feed that to her member of Congress. And whether she didn't have an impact, but I still think it's significant in that she was engaging someone and being a voice in a very conservative office based upon her experience in the immigration clinic. So I think it's small, but I really think developing relationships and engaging in conversations and then educating younger people are ways in which I've tried to impact the system.
Tanya?
So I have a slight variation on who to engage. Well, because I'm currently not able to speak as much to engaging in the South, engaging white conservatives in the South. I think there are ways in which I work with organizations, faith-based organizations. We support faith-based organizations in many ways, and I think there's an opportunity there, actually. I think you can go back to Christian values or Jewish values. You can go, you can go to Islamic values. I mean, all of the above would actually, those principles are inherent within those faiths. And so I think we have seen a coalition of organizations and people come together on the conservative and liberal level, even on the criminal justice arena, that has occurred because there are basics that people have gravitated around. So I think that there's an opportunity there, and I think maybe look into organizations. We currently, I work with Sojourners, which actually also sends out, they have a newsletter that they send out. They also have programs, and we also support the Lawyers in College program. If you all were not a part of that in the past election, I encourage you to be a part of it moving forward. It's what it says, it's Lawyers in College, bringing together to help protect the right to vote. But there's other ways. There's Faith in Action, there's Faith in Public Life. There's a number of faith organizations that I try to do this work. But what I was also going to get to is that it's not always just about engaging white conservatives or in the rural arenas. It's sometimes your own family. Because we're not always where we should be either. And I say this speaking of my own family, and I've had to pick and choose my conversations. I recognize when I need to have a conversation when I just feel like eating. And sometimes you just have to pick and choose your battles. But there's little inroads that you have to make, particularly about these many issues. And so I think we also have to actually face our family and within ourselves, because even particularly, I think many of us know this, particularly in the Black community, while politically the community writ large, I'll say this because we're not monolithic, but there is a high tendency to be more politically liberal. However, socially, there is often more conservatism that exists there, and on many levels. And so I've had to have those direct conversations, or at least had to say, so no. That's incorrect. Or no, that is racist. Yes, speaking of me. Or no, that is a very discriminatory standard that you are perpetuating right now. Particularly, it could be against LGBT community. It could be against even people with disabilities. It could be on many levels. And so I say that just acknowledging that we got to have those internal conversations as well.
Paul, did you want to say? Okay. Yeah, another question back here.
Professor Butler, are you seeing any evidence across the country of increased acceptance for petitions to modify sentences of people who are incarcerated? I'm thinking particularly of elderly and people in poor health who really shouldn't be locked up anymore. And also people who committed crimes while they were juveniles and are sentenced to long terms. And the Supreme Court has given some indication that those sentences should be revisited. So are you seeing evidence of increased use of petitions to modify across the country?
Okay, so yes, so that's good work that lawyers are doing. One way that the Brilliant Center gets to how we could let 40% of people who are locked up come home tomorrow and be just as safe is looking at the aging of the prison population. So now about 10% of prisoners are older than 55. Some prisons are opening assisted living facilities for their inmates. So obviously those people are not going to harm others. They're not getting the kind of services that they need while they're locked up. And so when the Supreme Court establishes rules, often there's a concern about whether it applies retroactively. And so what the Supreme Court has said with regard to people who commit crimes when they're children is not that they can't get mandatory life without parole sentences. It's still a very conservative court. And what the court, or actually not that they can't get life without parole, but those sentences can't be mandatory. So where the court is now is that if you're an adult and you commit a crime, the sentence can be a mandatory life without parole, LWOP. For children who commit crimes, who are eligible for life without parole, the sentence can't be mandatory. The judge can still impose it, but first she has to do an individual reckoning of the child. And sadly, this kind of tells you where we are on these issues. It turns out that after the court decided their case, there are a lot of children or people who committed crimes when they were children who received mandatory sentences of life without parole. And so then the issue is, does this new law, this new right that the court has granted, apply to these other folks? And thankfully, again, due to great lawyering, the court said that it does. And so we made a lot of headway on the idea of abolishing the death penalty. We're not there yet. I think in 25 years we will be. So the next fronts are abolishing life without parole. You know, that we don't know enough to tell anybody, you know, God's finished with you. You're never going to be better. And so there should always be some kind of hope, some opportunity for redemption. And then after that, you know, this is kind of the slow walk to abolition. After that will be the idea of life as a punishment. In Norway, the maximum sentence for any crime is 21 years. That's a long, long time to be locked up. Our sentences are so long now that we've lost our sense of perspective. My students don't think that 5 years is a long time in prison. My students think that that's a slap on the wrist. 5 years is a long, long time to be in prison.
We're out of time, I'm afraid, so I know folks have to go, so I don't want to hold. As you can see, we could continue to talk about this all day and not even scratch the surface. So what I do want to say, partly in response to your question over here, is one of my answers would be, the way we can do it is to keep having these conversations every day, everywhere, every chance we can get. And we're trying to do our little part. We started our year this year in Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma. In that part of the heart of the South, the heart of the Confederacy, and try to start that conversation there. We're having it here again. We're going to continue it in Baltimore with a meeting on this exact theme. Hope y'all will come. And we're going to finish up in San Francisco at our annual meeting where John Lewis is going to be our Thurgood Marshall awardee, and I can guarantee you he's going to talk to you about this topic. So please just talk about it as much as you can. And the second thing I want to say is please thank these very eloquent people for being here today.